Now let's explore some of the different ways you can create texture, either by hand painting it with brushes, or by creating a custom texture that you can repurpose again and again. I've gone ahead and opened the primitives PSD, and we can use these objects to try out some different techniques for adding texture. So first I'd like to start with the texture brushes, and these were introduced in Corel Painter 2017. There are two different categories of texture brushes. There's texture cover and texture source blending. Texture cover means that the texture is going to cover the layers underneath, whereas texture source blending is going to blend with what's underneath. So let's start with texture source blending. And we have three basic kinds of blending. We have color blending, chroma blending, and luminance blending. Luminance is going to be the light and dark values in your piece. Chroma is going to be just the color minus the light and dark. And color control means that you can choose a color to blend with the texture. So let's start with soft luminance. I'm going to select the cylinder group and the cylinder layer. That's this layer here. And I'm going to turn on preserve transparency. Next, we'll need the texture painting panels, and you can get to those a number of ways. One is with a texture brush selected. Up here in the enhanced properties bar, you can click on show or hide the texture brushes panel, and that will pop open a palette drawer for textures. Now I've gone ahead and created a custom palette drawer that's glazing, dab stencil, and texture, and so it popped it open there, and you can see there's my textures. You can also find that under window, palette drawers, and there is a texture palette drawer, but again, I've gone ahead and customized mine and given it a different name. You can also find the texture panels under media library panels, textures, but the enhanced property bar will probably be the fastest. So I want to be able to see texture brushes, textures, and texture libraries. In the textures palette is where we can actually choose the texture, and you can see here's all the default textures that come with Corel Painter. There's this high-tech one. There's this one that looks like old paint on a desk. There's one that looks like concrete. There's one that looks like a brick wall. And to some degree, you can customize these textures if you like. You can also import your own textures, and these can be textures that you hand-painted or textures that you photographed. So let's go ahead and just use this brick wall texture. We'll use the soft luminance brush, and let's paint on that cylinder layer, and let's see what happens. We're adding a brick texture to the luminance values, so we're blending the light and dark from the brick wall texture with the light and dark from the original cylinder. Now let's try that on the cube as well. I'm going to select the front of the cube, and I'm going to paint. And what's happening here? Why am I not getting the texture? Well, that's because you need to be able to show the texture, and this is the texture that you'll be applying, so you could think of it kind of like a stencil. If there's no texture covering the cube over here, I can't paint the texture. I can only paint texture where the texture is showing here. So I need to move that texture over. I can do that in the enhanced properties bar here by clicking on move. I can take the texture and I can move it over on top of the cube so it's covering the whole cube. I can click on the check to commit to apply that. Now we can ignore this warning dialog for now. We're not going to be saving this as a custom texture. I can control the visibility of the texture if I want it to be faint, or I can turn it all the way up. I'm just going to go ahead and hide the texture again by clicking on show texture, and then I'll paint. And now I'm getting this texture on top of my cube. Now what's happening here is this is adding it to that cube layer, so this texture is not on a separate layer, meaning that once I've painted it on there, it's kind of permanent. Unfortunately, if I try to do the select layer content trick and create a new layer and then paint with these source blending brushes, nothing is going to happen because you need to be painting on top of pixels for the blending to be able to work. Now, one thing that you can do is you can fill that new layer with a neutral gray, which is 0 for the hue, 0 for the saturation, and 128 for the value. And I'll just simply go to fill. And then if I set my composite method to overlay, that's going to make that particular gray disappear. And now I can paint with the source blending. And then now I have control over the opacity. But then I'm stuck with this overlay blend mode. Let's go ahead and try a different texture. Let's try this high-tech one. Let's use this on the sphere. I'm going to turn on preserve transparency and paint directly on this layer. That's covering it up quite a bit. I can play with the opacity as well if I want to reduce the opacity of the texture. And now it blends a little less. Let's try some of the other modes. Let's try basic color control. I'm going to select blue for my color. And let's go to the torus and let's add some texture to the torus. Again, you can see that I need to move my texture. So I'm going to select a move from the enhanced properties bar. I'm going to move that over. You'll notice that the texture is always starting in the top left, and most of the time it's not going to be covering your entire document. I can take it if I want to, and I can stretch it like this, and I can scale it up. Then it covers the whole thing. And then now if I paint, I'm adding color. Now it's blending quite a bit, so you can't really see a lot of that original shading. So again, I can reduce the opacity of the texture, and now when I paint, I'm getting some color for that texture, but it's also maintaining the original light and dark values of the torus that's underneath. And let's try the remaining mode, which is the chroma mode. I'm going to choose soft chroma. And chroma just deals with the color, not the light and dark values. So let's choose construction paper, and let's select our cone. I'll select the cone layer. And then of course we need to transform our texture again and make sure that it's covering our cone. And then if we go ahead and paint, you can see it's just adding chroma or just color information and not any of the light and dark. And to show you the difference here, I'll select the soft luminance, which is just the light and dark. And you can see there's a little bit of banding there because there's light and dark values in those stripes. But it's not until I select the chroma that I get the actual color information. So these texture brushes are really kind of the quickest and easiest way to add texture. However, they're not the best because they don't offer you very much in terms of controlling or customizing the textures. They're a little inconvenient because you have to constantly resize and move the texture around. The texture pattern will probably repeat even if you do move it around and rotate it. The kind of textures that you can use in your work are limited to photos or texture generators if you don't know how to create custom textures yourself. And so because of those reasons, this isn't necessarily the best way to add texture, although it is one way, and so that's why I wanted to show you this first. Now, because I want to focus on some other ways to add texture, I'm not going to go into huge detail about how to use this feature. If you want to learn more about texture brush painting in Corel Painter 2017, you can check out some of my other videos. So let's move on to some other ways of painting texture that'll offer you a little more flexibility. I'm going to go ahead and go to File, Revert, and I'm going to revert this so that I remove all of these textures that I added. And let's start with brush-based textures. These are brushes that naturally create textures. In my workspace, I have a few saved here. These are brushes that I use often, such as the sponge. I'm going to select the sponge. This is called Sponge G. This is a custom brush, but just about any sponge will work. And let's go ahead and select the plane layer. I'm going to right-click on the plane, choose Select Layer Content. I'm going to create a new layer. I'll just call this Plain Text. That's short for Plain Texture. I'm going to hide the selection while still keeping it active by hitting Control-Shift-H on my keyboard. You can also get to that command by going to Select and then Hide Marquee. I'm going to make sure Preserve Transparency is not turned on, and I'm going to select Multiply for my composite method. I'm going to select a dark gray color, and I'm going to make my brush very large. I'm using the keyboard shortcut of Control and Alt while tapping and dragging my pen. And I'm going to paint in some texture using horizontal strokes. Make my brush smaller as I move into the background, and that helps my texture look like it's fitting into that perspective. If I want, I can add another layer. I can call that Plain Text Light. This will be some lighter texture. I'll set the composite method to Screen. I'll pick a lighter color, and I will follow that same principle of making my brush smaller as I move into the background. So now I have something that looks kind of like a stone or a marble texture on my plane. I can group those layers together, and you can see it before and after. Here's the texture, and then of course I have control over the opacity, so I can reduce the opacity to make it more subtle, or I can change it in any number of different ways. I can also continue to add more layers. I could add another layer where I can have a much bigger, broader texture across the whole thing. And so you can see using just one brush, I was able to get this nice stone texture with very little effort. So I use this sponge a lot, but the sponge kind of has its own fractal texture, and so if you want a little more control over the texture pattern that you get, you might want to try something like the chalk. So let's take a look at that. The chalk is a grainy brush, meaning that it uses paper grain. So I'm going to go ahead and just clear all of these layers here that I was using for the texture, but I'll just keep the layer names because those will come in handy. I'll deselect my selection with Control D. I'll go back to the plane layer, choose Select Layer Content, hide the selection with Control-Shift-H, and I'll go back to the plain texture layer. Let's just give these more specific names. I'll call this Plain Text Dark, and I'll call the other one Plain Text 2. So now I have 3 different layers of plain texture that I'll keep reusing. So this particular chalk brush that I'm using is called Glazing Chalk, but really any brushes that are using paper grain are going to come in handy here. You can access the paper grain through the Papers panel. That's also accessible up here in the Enhanced Properties bar, and you can pop it open here. You can also find that under Window and then Paper Panels. On that Plain Text Dark layer with the Glazing Chalk selected, I'm going to choose a paper. Let's choose Pebble Board. You can control the rotation of the paper, you can control the scale of the paper, and you can control the contrast to make it sharper or duller. And you can also control the brightness, which makes it deeper or more shallow. Let's go with something like that. I'm going to choose kind of a darker gray color, and let's just paint on a little bit of texture here. And you can see I'm getting that nice lumpy texture. However, if I make my brush smaller, the scale of that texture is not getting smaller. It doesn't work the same as the sponge does in that regard. So what I'd have to do is I'd have to change my paper's scale here. I'd have to make it really big for the foreground, paint in a little bit of texture in the foreground, and then gradually make it smaller as I move into the background, like so, to get that same perspective distortion effect. I'm going to go to the plain text light layer. I'm going to select a lighter gray, and let's try a different paper. Let's try Artist's Rough Paper. You can also invert these papers if you want to turn them inside out. So let's do that, and you can see I can add a few little chunks here and there. If I press lightly, I'm going to get very thin, light texture. If I press down firmly, I'm going to get very noticeable, very opaque patches. And so going back and forth between lighter and heavier pressure is going to give me a more varied result here. And then, of course, I want to change the scale occasionally. That's starting to look pretty good. I'm going to go to Plain Text 2. Let's select yet another paper texture. Let's try Simulated Wood Grain. You can feel free to just play around and experiment with these different settings here. I'm going to choose kind of a darker color again. We'll put in some of that. Increase the scale as I move into the foreground. And if we do a before and after, you can see that we have another nice stone-like texture. Now, it's also worth experimenting with other brushes that use grain, but I find that the bulk of my textures can be accomplished using just the sponge and the chalk brushes, unless I want a very specific kind of texture. Now, that's not all that we can do with grain, but we'll come back to grain a little bit later because I want to talk about the rest of the brush-based textures. So I'm going to go ahead and clear these texture layers yet again. And the next set of brushes that we'll look at are particle brushes. You could find those under particles. I also have a custom palette that I created that has some of my own custom particle brushes. Let's go ahead and select the Scratches brush, and I'm going to choose the cube. I'm going to right-click on that layer, choose Select Layer Content. I'll create a new layer. We'll just call this Front Text. Let's change the composite method to Overlay, and let's hide that selection while keeping it active with Control-Shift-H. I'm going to select kind of a lighter color here, and let's paint with this brush. This particular brush uses both your main and your additional color. So if you need to, click on your additional color and choose a darker color. That way you're getting light and dark speckles here. I'm going to zoom into this so we can see it better. And you can see that what this brush is doing is it's creating little randomly generated particles that move around and create little scratches. And that's giving me this nice scratched up texture on my cube here. Let's try something else. Let's try speckles. And you can see that we're getting little speckles, so I get kind of a sandy concrete kind of texture. You can get more coverage if I make a bigger brush here. In some cases, making your brush bigger will make the size of the particles bigger. Let's demonstrate one more brush. I'll choose Flow Fur. Let's go ahead and use that on the sphere. I'll go ahead and right-click on the sphere, choose Select Layer Content, hide the selection with Control-Shift-H, create a new layer. We'll go ahead and set that to Overlay. And let's put in a little bit of fur here to make this furry. Let's create one more layer. Let's set that to Multiply. Let's click on our main color. Let's choose a darker color, and we'll put in a little bit of darker fur here on the shadow area. And now we have a furry looking sphere. So the particle brushes are nice because they move so randomly that you get a much more organic look than something like the more static brushes that are dab-based or grain-based. But there's definite advantages and disadvantages to using both. So those are the brush-based textures. Let's move on to more of the grain-based textures. I'm going to hop on over here to the cylinder, and let's create a texture layer for the cylinder the same way we've been doing it before. I'm going to set that composite method to Multiply. And earlier we looked at adding some paper grain using the chalk brush. But recently added in Corel Painter 2017 is the ability to use flow maps as a source of texture. And we can also use some of the textures here in the Textures palette. Now this is made possible by the dab stencil technology. And so here in my glazing dab stencil and texture palette drawer, I have my dab stencil palette. You can access that by choosing a dab stencil brush. There's a whole category of them here. Then you can look under dab options, and then you can pop open the dab stencil panel, or you have control over your dab stencil. You can also find dab stencil under window, brush control panels, and then down here at the bottom, dab stencil. But I find that it's handy just to keep it open. I also like to keep my flow maps and my papers open at the same time so that I can see them. If you want to find your flow maps, that's under Window, Flow Map Panels, and then there's Flow Maps. So over here in the Dab Stencil panel, we have Apply Dab Stencil, and you can apply a dab stencil to just about any brush. So it's something that if you wanted to, you could turn it on and off for different brushes. And then we can control the source here. Do we want it to be a flow map, a paper, or a texture? And by texture, they're referring to the textures palette here. So let's start with paper. So I'm using the flow map chalk brush here. That's just one of the default brushes. And you can see I can add in my paper grain like I was doing earlier. However, I can change that source to flow map instead. Now I can choose a flow map, let's say this fine dots flow map. And now I'm getting both the flow map dot pattern and the paper grain. So you can see a little bit of each here. I'll show you that again. I'll choose a different paper grain this time. Let's choose one of these watercolor paper ones that looks really wacky here. And you can see that I'm getting both. If I choose something a little more subtle like artist rough paper, and I reduce the contrast of that, then you're going to end up seeing more of that dot pattern instead. Just like I can control the properties of the paper, I can also control the properties of the flow map. So if I want there to be bigger dots, I can increase the scale. Well, they're so big that you don't even really notice them. I can make them a medium size, or I can make them very fine and very small. But having that combination of paper grain and flow maps gives you some really organic results. So if I pick something that's a little more appropriate like clouds to go with the artist's rough paper, then this is giving me more of a stone texture. And of course I can add a new layer. I could set the composite method to screen. I could pick a lighter color. I could rotate my grain. I could rotate my paper, maybe scale both of them up and down a bit. Now I'm getting a completely different texture, and I have control over that using the opacity since it's on a separate layer. So now I have kind of a marble pillar going on here for my cylinder. I'm going to go ahead and clear those extra layers. And let's take a look at the third source option, which is texture. And as I mentioned, that's this texture here. So I'm going to select brick wall. I'll also show my texture real quick. And I'll look under transform textures here. There's a palette for that, and I can go ahead and just scale that down a bit. I'm going to hold shift so I don't accidentally stretch or squish my texture. I'm going to make it smaller so that it's going to fit right on that cylinder and it'll be more noticeable. I'm going to go ahead and click on commit to commit that transformation. I'll just hide that texture. I'm also going to select my glazing chalk brush for this one. I'll want to set it to texture, and let's go ahead and paint. And you can see that it's adding the bricks here. Let's try a different texture. Let's try this high-tech one. And the light and dark areas of this texture are creating the dab stencil. Now typically I'm just using either paper or flow map. I generally lean towards flow map because if I use flow map, then I get the best of both worlds. I can select both a paper and a flow map, which makes my texture more varied and more organic. Another way to add texture using grain is through the blenders. I'm going to stay on the cylinder layer here, but I'm going to turn on preserve transparency, and I'm going to deselect any active selections with Control D. Then I'm going to select the coarse oily blender. The coarse oily blender uses grain, but it can also use the dab stencil, and right now I have a dab stencil applied to it, which is using flow map. So if I blend, you can see that I can smudge the paint together, but I'm also kind of constraining it into that texture there. So if I make the texture smaller, you can see that I get a smaller result. Let's try changing the flow map to the dot pattern, and it's more apparent now. So what I'm doing here is I'm blending, but I'm also adding texture as I'm blending. Now this can be very helpful for achieving a wood pattern. I'm going to go back to clouds, and I'm going to blend a bit. And then I'll switch to the diffuse blur blender, which is a lighter, softer blender. And I'm just going to pull straight down to create kind of a streaky effect that follows the direction of the cylinder. And that gives me kind of a spotty wood effect. Or I can also play with the opacity of the coarse oily blender, and I can get a more streaky result like this. I can also paint over it with the chalk and the sponge as well. And again, I can blend with that coarse oily blender, following the direction of the cylinder to help it look like wood. The last grain-based texture that we'll look at are surface textures. We'll go ahead and apply one of those to the cube. I'm going to select the cube front layer, and I'm going to select a paper grain. Let's choose gessoed canvas, and I'll go to Effects, Surface Control, Apply Surface Texture. And you can see it's adding a canvas texture to the front of my cube here. You can of course control the amount to make it more shallow, or you can make it more prominent, and you can control the angle of the lighting and all kinds of different controls. But generally speaking, the first thing you have selected here is going to work. If you want to see what different papers look like, you have control over your papers up here as well. So I can try some different options here to get some different textures. That one looks kind of cool. If you wanted to increase the scale of that texture, then you would want to increase that here, and then just reapply the surface texture again to get a larger scale texture. Let's go ahead and click OK, and that has been applied to that front layer. Now, if you wanted that to be on a separate layer, what you would do is you would right-click on the front layer, choose Select Layer Content, create a new layer for your texture, set that to Overlay, and you would want to turn off Preserve Transparency and fill that overlay layer with that neutral gray, that's 00128. You can deselect your active selection with Control D, then you can go to Effects, Surface Control, Apply Surface Texture, and then that's on a separate layer, and you can reduce the opacity of it and change it in a number of different ways. In my opinion, surface texture tends to look kind of artificial, and so I will use it in some cases, but for the most part, I tend to avoid it because I know it seems like a really quick and easy way to add texture, but unless you spend a lot of time trying to randomize it, it's going to look like a flat repeating pattern, and it might make your artwork look more two-dimensional rather than three-dimensional like it's supposed to. A couple of the things you can do to help your surface texture look less repetitive are to add more than one layer of texture. So let's go ahead and add a second layer of texture. I'm going to choose the worn pavement texture. I'm going to right-click on the layer that I want to add the texture to and choose Select Layer Content, create a new layer for that additional texture, hide the selection with Control-Shift-H. I want to fill it with that same neutral gray color, and I want to set the composite method to Overlay. Then we'll choose Effects, Surface Control, Apply Surface Texture, and now we have that second layer of texture. Now if we look at them before and after, you can see that once I put that second layer of texture on, the two overlapping textures help to kind of randomize each other. And of course, you can play with the balance and the opacity. What can also help is to add a mask to a texture layer, select black, and then select something like the sponge to paint and mask away some of that texture. We'll go ahead and increase the opacity of this brush. And you can see what it's doing is it's eating away at some of that texture. And so it's helping it look much more random. You could also use the chalk brush to go in and eat away at certain areas and remove some of that repeating pattern. But now if I combine the texture with the mask with the second layer of texture, you can see it's giving it a nice textured result. As I mentioned earlier, you can apply a texture to your entire canvas. You could of course create a new layer on top of all of your layers, fill it with that neutral gray color, set the composite method to Overlay. You could select a canvas texture or whatever texture you like, and then go to Effects, Surface Control, Apply Surface Texture, and that'll apply a surface texture to your whole piece. However, as I mentioned earlier, this looks kind of artificial, and so of course you'd want to add a mask and maybe mask out some areas of it to kind of break it up and make it look less repetitive. Or you might want to add additional layers of texture, and that might kind of help to break it up a little bit and help it look more realistic. So those are the grain-based methods for adding texture. Next, let's take a look at how to do it using image hose nozzles. And image hose nozzles offer a lot of versatility because you can paint your own custom textures and then make them into a brush that you can use over and over again. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about how to create image hose nozzles. I have lots of videos you can watch about how to do that, but I will demonstrate the power of using image hose nozzle textures. So I'm going to go ahead and just revert again by going to File, Revert. And I'm going to open my Particle and Image Hose Nozzles custom palette drawer, but you can also find the Image Hose Nozzles under Window, Media Library Panels, Nozzles, or if you have an image hose brush selected, you can access the library up here in the Enhanced Properties bar. I prefer to keep my nozzle libraries open so I can choose from multiple nozzles quickly and easily. Let's go ahead and use our plane as the example this time. I'm going to right-click, choose Select Layer Content, hide the selection with Control-Shift-H and create a new layer. I'm going to set the new layer to Overlay. And I'm going to select a nozzle. Now these are all custom nozzles that I created that are available in my custom workspace. I'm going to look under textures because that has a bunch of different textures that'll come in handy. Let's try relief blobs first. Now this is the nozzle and this is what's going to come out of the image hose brush. You could think of it like water or paint. However, we need to control how it comes out of the nozzle, so we need to choose an image hose brush. Now there's a bunch of different image hose brushes here that control how all of your objects come out of the brush. Down here in the bottom, you can kind of see an example of how they're going to spray out. Some of them will be spray, some of them will be a stream. You could think of it like the different settings on a garden hose. I also have some brushes I created myself here in the image hose palette, and I'm just going to choose from those. I'm going to choose spray size P angle W, and what that's going to do is that's going to spray out these little dots randomly, and I can go through and I can use heavier pressure for bigger blobs and lighter pressure for smaller blobs. And if I do it just right, I can get kind of a nice lumpy pattern, and I can reduce the opacity, and I get this nice texture. So I get these repeating elements in the texture, but I have more control over how they flow. I can fit them into perspective and make them bigger or smaller, and I can make them more varied and more organic. It's not just something that I'm applying as a filter, and it's going to repeat it sequentially in a grid. This is something that's going to be completely random. So maybe the blobs doesn't work that well for this particular object, so let's pick something more appropriate. Let's try metal bumps. I'm going to use lighter pressure here in the background and firmer pressure in the foreground, and that'll give me a larger scale. Now I'm getting that larger scale because size is connected to pressure. That's what size P means here. So just the same, I could choose linear size P, and now they'll come out kind of single file. They're not going to spray, but I'm still going to get kind of the same result. Let's try another texture. Let's try fabric ripples. And I can put in some of those. I might increase the opacity here. This gives me kind of a nice rippled pattern, and that helps this look kind of like maybe it's a blanket or a sheet or something now, rather than a flat plane. Let's try splatter bump. Let's see how that looks. This nice bumpy pattern here. And these are all different textures that I created myself, but you can see they're very versatile. Now what's important is that when you're using these pre-made texture brushes, you do want to consider that they're going to have a fixed light source. And in this particular texture, the light is actually coming from the right, whereas in the scene, the light is coming from the top. So the lighting sources don't necessarily match. So if I want the light source to be at a different angle, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select linear size P angle D. And now depending on the angle of my brush stroke, I can change the angle of the light source. So you can see that by painting a circular stroke, the lighting is different on each side. So I could paint straight down with this brush, and now my light's going to be on the top side. So I could do something like this and put in the texture, and as long as I'm painting these vertical straight down strokes, then my texture is going to have the light facing in the right direction. If I set that layer to overlay, it's going to blend better with the layer underneath. And now I have a texture that has correct lighting. Again, you could layer these textures up, so if I want to select metal dents and put that in, I can put in some little dents here and there, and that's going to help break up my texture and help it look more organic. I could do some dents on a separate layer, and I could set that to multiply if I want them to blend a little bit darker and create little holes and things like that. Let's go ahead and try one more example. Let's go to the cylinder. Let's create an overlay layer for that. And let's try the bark texture here. Now some of these thumbnails will recommend what the best brush to use is. It doesn't mean that's the only brush you can use, but in this example it says linear size P angle D is the best. So I'm going to choose linear size P angle D. And I'm going to paint in my nice bark texture here. Again, depending on the direction that I paint is going to control the direction of the texture. So in this case, I want it to be going this direction, and I get this nice bark texture. If I wanted to add some of that to the torus, I could do that. I'll choose select layer content, hide the selection, create a new layer, set it to overlay, and I could paint in some texture on that using a nice circular stroke, and then reduce the opacity a bit. Now I get a nice curved texture that follows the contour of the torus. So you can really accomplish just about anything with these image hose nozzles. I would consider these to be one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful way to add textures in my paintings.